My family's inheritance wasn't wealth or property, but a devastating generational curse that shadowed every single one of us. It twisted our opportunities, stole our joy, and left a trail of broken dreams. But the most incredible part? The harrowing journey we undertook to uncover its ancient roots, battle its insidious power, and finally, miraculously, shatter its hold forever. This is the raw, emotional truth of how I freed my entire lineage. Before we continue, if you love our stories, do well to encourage us by hitting the like button, share, and subscribe for more. My name is Vane-Stryffe. I am 29 years old, a senior financial analyst, and for my entire life, I believed that hard work could outrun a bad reputation. I grew up watching my parents lose everything they touched, so I became the opposite. I was precise, tireless, and perfect. I climbed the corporate ladder until I was 1 second away from the VP seat. Then it happened. During the final board meeting, a freak scandal erupted. Money I never touched appeared in accounts I never opened. It was a surgical strike against my integrity. As the security guards escorted me out, I didn't see the angry faces of my bosses. Instead, I saw a familiar, thick gray haze swirling in the corners of the room. We call it the Silt. It is a heavy, suffocating miasma that has followed my family for 3 centuries. It isn't just bad luck. It is a quiet erosion of everything good. I stood on the sidewalk, my career in ruins, and watched the silt thicken. It felt like cold, wet wool pressing against my skin. I reached into my bag, clutching the emergency kit I'd kept since I was 18, a bundle of cash and a burner phone. My inheritance wasn't wealth. It was a devastating, hungry darkness. The day my life fell apart was also the day my brother, Cyprian, slipped away. Cyprian was a vibrant muralist, the kind of person who could make a drab brick wall look like a gateway to another dimension. He was the only one of us who still smiled. I found him in his studio, collapsed beneath a half-finished painting of a sun-drenched field. His body was stiff, locked in a terrifying seizure that seemed to defy medicine. I knelt beside him, screaming for help, but as I held his hand, his eyes rolled back. He started whispering in a low, gravelly voice. It wasn't English. It was a rhythmic, clicking language that sounded like dry bones snapping together in a hollow box. He spoke with a terrifying, ancient authority, his words echoing off the studio walls. The dead is ink, the blood is dry. He hissed before his body went completely limp. He fell into a catatonic state, a deep sleep that the doctors couldn't explain with any scan or test. I stayed by his side in the hospital, watching the silt settle over his bed like a heavy blanket. The doctors called it a neurological mystery, but I knew better. This was the same madness that took my ancestors in the 1880s. Geography and modern medicine couldn't save us. I couldn't just sit in a hospital waiting room and watch Cyprian fade away. I went to our family's private storage vault, a cold, metallic room filled with the debris of 100 failed lives. I spent 48 hours straight digging through boxes of old ledgers, death certificates, and legal filings. I began to map out what I called the red threads. It was a chilling mathematical proof of our misfortune. I saw how my grandfather's promising textile mill went bankrupt in 1928 for no logical reason, just weeks before he was supposed to sign a massive contract. I saw the records of my father's mysterious heart failure in 1994. He was a marathon runner who dropped dead at 40. Every single generation had a peak and a plunge. We would get so close to happiness or success, and then the silt would rise to drown us. The patterns were too perfect to be random. It was a consistent, intentional thread of misery that spanned 14 generations. I realized that our family wasn't just unlucky. We were being harvested like a crop. We were allowed to grow just high enough before being cut down to feed something ancient and hungry. I packed my bag, checked my hidden cash, and headed to Oakhaven. The drive to Oakhaven felt like traveling backward through time. Our ancestral estate sat at the end of a winding, overgrown road that the local maps seemed to ignore. The house was a massive, decaying structure of dark wood and stained stone. As I stepped onto the porch, the air grew heavy and cold, tasting of copper and damp earth. The house didn't just feel old, it felt sentient. It seemed to breathe with a heavy, rhythmic sorrow that vibrated in the floorboards beneath my boots. Every window looked like a tired, judging eye watching my arrival. The gardens were choked with weeds that looked like twisted iron, and the scent of rot hung thick in the stagnant air. I remembered stories of this place, how servants used to quit after 1 hour because of the heavy feeling in their chests. Now, standing there alone, I felt it too. It was a physical weight on my shoulders, a pressure in my lungs that made every breath a struggle. I realized that Oakhaven was the heart of the Silt. This was where the shadow was born, and this was where it lived. The house groaned as I pushed open the front door, the sound echoing through the empty halls like a long-suppressed sob. Inside the grand, shadowed foyer, I wasn't alone. Matriarch Vespera stood at the top of the sweeping staircase, her silhouette sharp against the dim light. She was the eldest living Vane-Stryffe, a woman who looked like she was carved from flint and old, brittle silk. She didn't offer a hug or a word of comfort about Cyprian. Instead, her eyes narrowed with a cold, terrifying intensity. "You shouldn't have come here, Bowen," she rasped, her voice like sandpaper on wood. I told her I was here to find the root of the trouble, to stop the madness that had taken my brother. Vespera let out a dry, haunting laugh that chilled my blood. She told me that our misery was a divine refinement, a burden we were chosen to carry to keep us humble and connected to our history. She spoke as if the curse was a holy relic rather than a parasite. She strictly forbade me from digging up the rot or looking into the old foundations of the family history. I looked into her eyes and saw a woman who had grown addicted to her own pain, wearing her suffering like a crown. She wasn't a victim of the Silt anymore. She was its gatekeeper, and she would protect the darkness. I spent my first night at Oakhaven in the library, a room that smelled of dust and forgotten secrets. That was where I met Thowric Thorn. He wasn't a relative, but an archivist Vespera had hired years ago to organize the family's vast collection of ancient papers. He was a quiet man with silver-streaked hair and eyes that looked like they had seen too much. When I told him about the strange, clicking language Cyprian spoke, his face went pale. He led me to a restricted shelf and pulled down a heavy book bound in cracked black leather. "Your brother wasn't speaking gibberish, Bowen," Thowric whispered. He explained that it was a dead dialect from the 17th century, specifically used in blood contracts. Thowric had been at Oakhaven so long he had inhaled the Silt, and because he was the one translating the linguistic rot in the journals, the curse had begun to notice him. He told me the words seemed to bleed off the page and infect the mind. Thowric became my only ally. He saw the Silt just like I did, and he knew that Cyprian's catatonia wasn't a disease. It was a summons. The past was calling for a new payment, and my brother was the currency chosen to settle the interest. The next day, the visions began. I was walking through the overgrown orchard when the world suddenly blurred into a kaleidoscope of shadows. The modern trees vanished, replaced by a dark, primeval forest that felt cold and suffocating. I wasn't just watching. I was inside the mind of Malachi Vane, my ancestor from 1692. I felt his cold sweat and his pounding heart as if they were my own. He was kneeling in the mud, surrounded by men with torches who wanted his life for a betrayal that had ruined the valley. To save himself, Malachi was talking to something shifting in the darkness, a primal entity born from the very soil. He didn't offer money, he offered the vibrancy of his bloodline. I watched in horror as he promised that every joy, every success, and every spark of life in his descendants would be harvested to pay his debt. The entity accepted, and I felt a cold, oily ripple move through my own veins across 3 centuries. This was the foundational fracture. Our entire history was built on a cowardly lie. Malachi hadn't built a legacy. He had sold the souls of his children to buy himself a few more years of comfort. I woke up in the dirt, the taste of mud still bitter. When the vision snapped back, I was shaking. Thowric found me and helped me back to the house. We spent the night decoding the specifics of Malachi's trade. It was worse than I thought. The entity didn't just take our money, it took our vitality. This explained why every Vane-Stryffe who showed promise, like Cyprian with his art or me with my career, was targeted. The entity was like a landlord, and the Silt was its way of collecting rent on our souls. We weren't just unlucky. We were being systematically drained to keep an ancient, dark power alive. The price of our ancestors' survival was our permanent misery. Malachi had traded the light of 14 future generations, just so he wouldn't have to face the mob. As I looked at the family portraits on the walls, I realized we were traditionally raised to hate Malachi, but that hate was exactly what kept us connected to him. Our resentment was a bridge. The silt wasn't just a curse. It was a debt that could never be paid in full because the interest was our very happiness. I realized that to break this, I had to stop hating him and start ignoring the debt altogether. I vowed the ledger would be closed with me. Thalric and I began to study the anatomy of the curse. We discovered that the silt was reactive. It fed on our reactions. Every time a Vane-Stryffe gave in to despair, the curse grew thicker. Despair was the fuel, and hopelessness was the harvest. Thalric showed me a hidden room in the cellar where the walls were stained with a dark, pulsating residue. This was the heartstone of the curse. It pulsed like a slow, dying heart, vibrating with a low frequency that made my bones ache. We realized that by fighting it with anger, we were actually making it stronger. It was like a cornered animal. The more I tried to uncover the truth, the more the silt would try to crush me physically. I understood why no one had ever broken it before. To break it, you had to be willing to lose everything first, your status, your pride, and your fear. You had to starve the entity by refusing to feel the very despair it was trying to force upon you. It was a psychological war where the enemy knew exactly which buttons to push. I began to practice a cold, clinical detachment, refusing to let the gray haze trigger the usual panic in my chest. The curse sensed my progress and fought back. That evening, my phone shattered in my hand. When I tried to log into my bank account, I found my identity had been flagged, and every cent I owned was frozen. My car wouldn't start. The engine block was cracked as if struck by a giant. Then, the physical sickness hit me. My lungs felt like they were filling with wet ash, and my vision became a permanent shade of gray. The silt was trying to isolate me, to trap me in Oakhaven and drain me before I could act. I felt a crushing weight on my chest, whispering that I should just give up. Vespera watched me from the shadows. "Accept it, Bowen," she said. "The pain stops when you stop fighting." But I looked at a photo of Cyprian and felt a spark of pure, hot defiance. I used my hidden stash of cash to hire a local driver. The driver arrived moving in a daze, his eyes clouded by the silt that was now leaking out of the house. The curse was growing desperate, expanding its reach to stop me. I forced myself to breathe through the ash in my lungs, focusing only on the next step. Before I tell you how I turned the tables on my family's doubts and executed the most dangerous phase of this spiritual war, I have to ask, if you have come with us this far, it means you are really invested in Bowen's journey. Please do well to like this story, share it with friends who love satisfying stories of breaking free, and subscribe so you never miss a part. Also, tell us in the comments where you are listening from. We love seeing our global community. Thank you. The silt was a physical pressure now. At the hospital, the staff moved like ghosts, their eyes glassy and lethargic. The curse was clouding their perception, so they wouldn't notice me. I carried a small vial of soil I had cleansed by washing it in the estate's spring water while focusing on a memory of pure joy. The day Cyprian and I built a sandcastle that the tide couldn't reach. As I entered his room, the gray haze was so thick I could barely see. I began the first sundrant. I sprinkled the clean earth around his bed and whispered his name, refusing to let my voice shake. I focused on the sun on our backs that day at the beach. For a second, the gray air sparked and thinned. The machines began to beep with a steady, healthy rhythm. His eyelids flickered. It wasn't a full awakening, but his vitals stabilized. The curse recoiled, and for the first time, I saw the debt collector in the corner of the room, a shadow that looked like a man made of smoke. It hissed, but it couldn't cross the circle of cleansed earth. I had drawn a line, and for the first time in 3 centuries, a Vane-Stryffe had won. Back at Oakhaven, the atmosphere was lethal. Matriarch Vespera was waiting in the dining hall with the elders. They looked like living corpses, their skin gray and translucent. Vespera told me that by trying to break the pattern, I was endangering the stability of the lineage. She gave me an ultimatum: stop or be formally exiled. In our family, exile was a spiritual severance meant to lead to total ruin. Vespera believed the curse itself would kill me once I was cast out. I looked at their sunken eyes and realized they were terrified of a world without their misery. I told them to keep their stability. I chose the war. Vespera's face twisted in rage as she declared me dead to the family. She didn't try to stop me physically. Her arrogance made her believe I would simply wither away without the family protection. I retreated to the library, barricading the door with heavy oak tables. By rejecting them, I had broken the strongest tether, the need to belong to a broken system. I sat in the dark, feeling the severance ripple through me, but instead of weakening, I felt my own strength finally having room to grow without their constant doubt. Exile was supposed to destroy me, but it gave me clarity. I realized the curse relied on the Vane-Stryffe way, always being cautious and expecting the worst. I decided to start pattern breaking. It was a grueling mental exercise. Every time I felt the urge to hide, I stood in the center of the hall. I began making radical choices. I wore a bright red shirt, a color my mother always said invited bad eyes. I called an estranged aunt and told her I loved her, breaking a 20-year silence. I was intentionally disrupting the spiritual architecture Malachi had built. The silt reacted like a wounded animal. Shadows danced in the corners of my eyes, and I heard whispering voices calling my name at night, trying to lure me into a panic. But I stayed grounded. I learned that the curse was a habit of the soul. By refusing to act like a victim, I was starving the entity. I was becoming a foreign object in my own bloodline, something the curse couldn't easily digest. Every act of joy was a strike against the heartstone. I was no longer a host for the parasite. I was the poison that would kill it from the inside out. The house began to protest. As I walked the halls, the gray haze densified into a dark, oily liquid that sweated from the wallpaper. It smelled like old blood and stagnant water. This was the Whispering Walls phase. The house was trying to drown me in the memories of every ancestor who had suffered. I saw flashes of a woman weeping in 1910 over a dead child and a man screaming in 1945 as his house burned. I realized the house was a record of every debt paid. To find the heartstone, I had to navigate this labyrinth without letting the sorrow touch my heart. Thaurik guided me to the basement, where the air was so thick it tasted like copper. We found a hidden crawlspace behind the main furnace. Inside was a small, circular room made of ancient, uncut stone. In the center sat a black, jagged rock that seemed to pull the light out of the air. It was the heartstone. It vibrated with a low, mournful hum that made my teeth ache and my stomach turn. This was where Malachi had spilled the blood to seal our fate. The room was a graveyard of hope, and the entity's presence was a cold pressure. Just as we prepared the dismantling, the curse struck at Thaurik. Because he had been my translator and bridge to the past, the silt lunged at him. He suddenly gasped, clutching his chest as his eyes turned a dull, stony gray. I watched in horror as he began to age before my eyes, his skin wrinkling like parchment. The entity knew I couldn't do this alone. I realized this was another test. The Vane-Stryffes were famous for abandoning each other to save themselves. That was part of the curse's isolation tactic. I refused to let him go. I grabbed Thaurik's hands and pulled him toward the exit, screaming that he was not a Vane-Stryffe and he owed nothing to this house. I used every ounce of my will to shield him, literally pushing the oily black liquid away with my bare hands. For a moment, I felt a searing pain, like my soul was being scorched by dry ice. But I got him out of the basement. By saving an outsider, I proved that a Vane-Stryffe was capable of selfless protection. The silt shrieked, a high, thin sound that cracked the cellar windows. I had proven that love was stronger than the debt. The air inside the Heartstone chamber felt like lead, but I didn't flinch. It was the night of 3 fires. I had gathered Malachi's original silk-bound ledgers, the portraits of the ancestors who had surrendered, and the final, ancient contract we had stolen from Vespera's safe. I built 3 pyres in a triangle around the Heartstone. As I struck the first match, the floorboards bucked like a living creature. Matriarch Vespera appeared at the door, her face a mask of terror. She tried to blow out the flames, screaming that I was destroying our special heritage. I pushed her back, not with hate, but with the strength of a man who was done with the dark. The first fire was for the past, the debt we never asked for. The second fire was for the present, the fear that kept us small. The third fire was for the future, the children yet to be born. As the flames licked the old parchment, the silt began to boil, turning into a thick, black smoke. I stood in the center, my lungs burning, refusing to move until every last scrap of Malachi's cowardice was turned to ash. I watched the spirits trapped in the paper curl and release. Then, the smoke began to take a shape. It rose from the floor, coalescing into the debt collector, the personified consciousness of the silt. It had no face, only eyes like empty pits. It didn't speak with words. It spoke with a pressure that bypassed my ears. It showed me images of my own failure, promising me my career back if I stopped. It demanded a final payment of a soul to close the account. "One must stay so the rest can go," it hissed. I looked into that void and felt the ancient hunger. For a second, I almost broke. But then I realized that the only reason the debt existed was that we kept acknowledging it. We were paying interest on a loan we never signed. I looked the entity in its eyes and spoke with a voice that came from my very bones. "I am not paying you," I whispered. "I am paying the truth. Malachi had no right to sell what wasn't his. I forgive his debt to us, and I forgive us for believing it was ours." I offered forgiveness instead of fear. The entity shrieked, its shadow form flickering as the ancient contract dissolved. Without our hate to bind it, the entity had no claim. The climax came with a sound like 1,000 mirrors shattering. As the fires consumed the last of the contract, I reached out and slammed my bare hand against the heartstone. I poured every memory of Cyprian's laughter into that cold black rock. A blinding white light erupted from the point of contact, tearing through the darkness. It was a sundrace, a total spiritual break. I felt a psychic shockwave ripple out of Oakhaven. I felt a connection snap, a sudden lightness that I knew was reaching every member of my lineage. It felt like a heavy, cold chain had been snapped off my chest. I fell to my knees, gasping for air that finally felt clean. In that moment, the black oily liquid on the walls turned to clear water and evaporated. The invisible tether that had dragged us toward disaster for 300 years was gone. The silt disintegrated into harmless dust. The house, once a prison, suddenly felt like nothing more than an old building with a draft. The weight was gone, and the silence that followed was finally peaceful. I looked at the heartstone. It had turned into a plain, gray pebble, its power completely drained. The debt was settled forever. I woke up on the cellar floor to my phone ringing. It was the hospital. The nurse's voice was full of disbelief. "Bowen, you need to come in. Your brother, he just woke up." I drove back to the city in a car that started on the first try, through streets that seemed brighter and more vivid than ever. When I burst into Cyprian's room, he was sitting up, drinking water. The gray haze that had clouded his eyes for years was gone. He looked at me, and his smile reached his eyes. "I had a dream that the world was gray, Bao," he whispered. "But the sun finally came out. I feel like I can breathe for the first time." Across the country, the news started coming in. My cousin's failing business had suddenly landed a major investor. My aunt's chronic illness had mysteriously gone into remission. It was an avalanche of good luck. But I knew it was simply what life looked like when the shadow finally stepped out of the way. Even Vespera was found wandering the orchard, confused but quiet. The silt had been the only thing holding her bitter mind together. The family was finally free to be ordinary. Months later, I returned to Oakhaven. The estate was being converted into a community art center. I watched as Kalen, Cyprian's young child, sat on the grass with a sketchbook. He was using vibrant neon colors, pinks, electric blues, and burning oranges. These were colors Cyprian had been too afraid to use in the old days. I looked at my own hands and realized they no longer shook. I had started a firm that helped other families break their own toxic patterns. My name, Vane-Stryffe, was no longer a warning, it was a promise. I stood on the edge of the cliff, breathing in the salt air, and realized that I was the first man in 14 generations to truly own his own future. The inheritance I left for Kalen wouldn't be a ledger of debts, but a legacy of absolute freedom. The silt was gone, and the Vane-Stryffe bloodline was finally beautifully clear. I watched the sun set over the water, knowing that for the first time in 3 centuries, the night would bring no shadows, only rest. We were no longer victims of the past. We were the architects of a brand new dawn for our family.
This story isn't just about an ancient ghost or a family mystery. It is a powerful reminder that there is no single right way to carry your history. Matriarch Vespera and the elders struggled because they believed that generational suffering was the only metric of loyalty. They judged Bowen based on his willingness to endure pain, rather than his courage to heal. They missed the strength in his heart because it didn't look like the holy burden they were used to. The lesson: never confuse tradition with truth. Just because a pattern is old doesn't mean it is right. And just because your ancestors lived in the shadows doesn't mean you aren't meant for the sun. True strength often looks like betrayal to those who are stuck in the old ways of misery. Embrace healing, question the curses you've been told are yours to carry, and remember, the goal of life is to flourish, not to destroy yourself by honoring the shadows of the past. Thank you so much for following Bowen's journey from the cursed analyst to the savior of his family. It was an emotional ride of vindication, and we hope you felt every moment of his triumph. If you enjoyed this story and love hearing about underdogs who prove everyone wrong, please smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Tell us in the comments. Do you think Bowen was right to defy the matriarch and risk exile? Or should he have tried to work within the family's rules? Type Team Pattern Breaker if you think he did the right thing by burning the past to save the future. See you in the next story.